Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And I want to extend a very special Carnegie welcome to any viewers who might be tuning in from Korea itself. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment. And together with my good friend, colleague, and collaborator, Mike Nelson, who is a Senior Fellow for Technology and International Affairs at Carnegie, I'm delighted to welcome you to this launch of a new volume called Korea's Path to Digital Leadership, generously supported by the Korea Foundation, that is, in fact, the third in a series of volumes that we've published at the Carnegie Endowment on Korea and the future of technology. One thing we found is that too much of the debate about Korea is focused on security issues. Not that that's not important, particularly with issues related to North Korea or the US-Korea alliance or strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific between the United States and China. But the reality is that Korea is an important but often understudied player on a variety of other issues too, related to political economy, global trade, the digital future, and technology governance. So over the last several years, in a project focused on Korea and the future of technology, Mike and I have tried to curate a conversation and then publish a series of volumes that look at Korea as a global technology governance player and increasingly as a standard setter as well. It's something that's distinctive to the Carnegie program, and we're very proud of the work that has resulted. In doing that work, we've tried to blow up or at least question a couple of prevailing narratives. One is the idea that because of the sharpening of strategic competition between the United States and China, that we face a world in the technology space of American rules versus Chinese rules. In fact, there are third, fourth, and fifth players that are also trying to set rules. And so in a first volume that we published called The Korean Way with Data, we tried to illustrate how South Korea has crafted coherent and consistent policies in three important areas related to data: cyber defense and data resilience, data localization, and also online authentication and data access control. A second debate that you often hear in the narrative is that it's a world of democracies versus autocracies in the realm of technology governance. But what we tried to do in a second volume, where we looked at Korea and India in comparative context, two large and important and capable Asian democracies, which showed the diversity of democratic experiences with technology governance. Now we've published this third volume on Korea's pathway to digital leadership, where we've tried to take a look at Korea's role as a critical but understudied player in the standards and standardization game. Korea has world-class, globally competitive companies. It has a $1.7 trillion economy. That's the 13th largest in the world. It's the fourth largest in Asia. And Korea has shown some willingness to develop homegrown standards. So in this volume, we try to dig into these Korean experiences and then compare them, interestingly, to those of other Asian players, most notably Malaysia and Japan, as well as the United States. Mike is going to curate a conversation with a few experts and one of our co-authors, and also frame some of the tricky and thorny questions that we think face the world of technology governance, and those who are interested not just in standard setting, but in standardization as well. We thank you for tuning in. We thank the Korea Foundation for its support. And Mike, with that, I'm going to hand it to you for what I know is going to be an exciting conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Evan. This has been a fascinating project, partly because we've gotten to work with a couple outstanding authors in Korea who have been giving us sort of the latest on what's happening in Korea's efforts to shape global policy on digital issues and particularly standards. I'm going to give a Twitter introduction to the main findings, and then I'll turn to our speakers, starting with Dasom Lee, who did the chapter on standards and standardization. I'll then turn to Mallory Knodel, who's with the Center for Democracy and Technology, who's both a policy expert and a standards expert, very involved in digital standard setting. And then lastly, I'll turn to Naomi Wilson, who's with the Information Technology Industry Council. In a way, we're looking at the narrow first, and then looking at the broader long list of policy issues that Korea is working on. And then at the end, we'll look at the regional examples that we can get from Malaysia and Japan. This is a unique study in that we are doing report cards. We've actually developed with Byung-il Oh and with the authors of our previous volumes a report card for 11 different areas of tech policy in Korea. And they do well in a few. They do very poorly in one. And unfortunately, in one area, which is broadband competition, they've gone from doing pretty well to sliding backwards. So that's something we'll discuss later. Let me give you 5 key points. First off, there are many different ways that a country can shape the digital future. We often talk about policy and regulation, but obviously technology standards, business practices, technical breakthroughs, invent a new product, change the world. Also government procurement. Most countries, the government's the largest purchaser of IT equipment, and they can steer what technologies are used in their country that way. And then there's marketing and vision, both marketing and vision from companies, but also from governments. And we're going to talk a little bit about each of those. The one thing that's common to all of those, though, is that government can be much more effective at using these different levers if it has a coherent, consistent message and has all the different agencies in government working in the same direction. And that's a recurring theme in this report. I have a whole chapter on the thorny questions, and I'll list those shortly. But these aren't all the tough questions, but they are the toughest political questions because often they're very emotional, like online privacy or pornography online. And you have different agencies that are pushing different agendas, often supporting different constituencies. And without digital leadership, without prime ministers and presidents or vice presidents, somebody who can get all the ministries in the room and say, look, figure out a consensus, you're often going to be stuck. And in most countries now, we are stuck on some of these issues. And it's not just been a year or two, it's often been 10 years or more. Korea has a number of places where they've taken these issues and put them in the president's office. And as a result, they're making progress. Another thing, the third point, is that we do have a lot to learn from Korea, both their successes in areas like connecting the unconnected and digital identity, and some of their failures, like in areas like broadband competition, which I mentioned. Third point is that the US was an early leader in showing how you could do interagency strategies. This is all the way back in the Clinton administration. It was very early and it was very easy because the internet was less than 10 million people. But there was a clear message coming from the White House, and they did bring together a number of agencies. The Department of Commerce provided a key role in working through coherent strategies on e-government, e-commerce, encryption. And in some ways, the US got a 3-year head start over most countries that were still trying to figure out who was doing what. Last point is that Korea is improving. And I think in 3 years, we could go back and their report card would be much more positive. It's already very positive. And then as a side note, I would say that we also were surprised to see just how far Malaysia has come, particularly in the last 10 years. They've often had a strategy and a vision. They're now implementing on a number of areas. And I think Malaysia can learn a lot from Korea. I think Korea could learn a lot from Malaysia. So with that, let me turn over to Dasom Lee, who's going to talk about some specific case studies where the Korean private sector is stepping up and getting more engaged in technical standards. This is an area that's critical to many of the biggest companies in Korea. But for decades, the government has been the leader in these technical standards. That's changing. In the past, The government often was pushing for Korea-only standards or Korea-specific standards, something the Japanese government used to do. The difference now, and Dasom will give us the details, is now the private sector stepping up to the international standards stage and making a difference there. Companies like Samsung and Hyundai and the other major IT companies. So Dasom, she's a assistant professor at the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy at Korea's Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. She's got a very long portfolio of papers. Standards is one of the many things she's worked on. More recently, she's delved into the issues around gender online. Of course, she's got a lot to say about artificial intelligence, and I wish I could read Korean to see and hear all of her lectures. But anyway, Dasom, thank you very much for being part of this project and for providing some unique insights. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I feel like I'm echoing a little. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, Mike. It is such a privilege to talk to everyone here. And I want to thank Carnegie for inviting me to do a chapter and for inviting me to this wonderful event. I'm not going to discuss all the case studies that I've written on the report, mostly because of the time issues. But I am going to talk about one major case study, and I'm going to talk about the overall argument of the chapter. So South Korea has been a leader in technology innovation for more than 2 decades, particularly in the areas of telecommunications, consumer electronics, and vehicles. Considering Korea's importance in global digital development, the country's private sector should consider ways to increase its impact on technology standard setting processes. Today, I'm going to discuss 2 primary ways by which Korean companies engage in setting international technology standards, one by industry and corporate leaders taking on positions of influence, and 2 by participating in standard setting workshops and seminars with other stakeholders. So before anything else, I'm going to tell you how technology standard setting processes work in South Korea. Technology standards differ from business norms and practices because they're considered to be international regulations that must be met in order to sell and distribute goods around the world in a safe and responsible manner. Both the Korean government and the private sector could help establish or revise the country's industry standards, and relevant government organizations such as the Korean Agency for Technology and Standards, also known as the CATS, could initiate the process for Korea to adhere to international standards for new and emerging technologies. CATS could hire associations or research institutes to draft standards for specific technologies and/or industries. Relevant stakeholders could propose the establishment or revision of standards at any time. And although the technology standard setting processes in Korea is largely led by the government, the private sector plays an important role by participating in workshops and being involved in international processes. So during this talk, I described in the manuscript, I described 4 technologies: 5G mobile network, smart meters, smart grids, and automated vehicles, but we don't have the time to discuss all of them today. So I'm just going to focus on one of them, the technology that everyone has at least heard of, the automated vehicles, the self-driving cars. The Korean government has been ambitious in the commercialization of automated vehicles. And despite this interest, the country has been somewhat lagging on developing standards for automated vehicles. It was California and the Netherlands, for example, that first started testing remote-controlled automated vehicles on public roads. And this technology is not yet allowed to be tested on public roads in Korea. But Korean automotive corporations are becoming more daring. For example, Hyundai announced that it would launch level 3 autonomous driving technology sometime in 2024. This release would make Hyundai one of the first, if not the first, company to commercialize level 3 automated vehicles to the public. The Korean private sector is therefore expected to play a more global role in this sphere, especially with Hyundai Mobis' Cho becoming the president of the ISL in 2024. And Hyundai Mobis organized an international forum in 2022 with Cho to discuss international automated vehicle standard setting processes. And this event was followed by a workshop in March 2023, which included researchers from several private companies such as Hyundai Mobis, LG Electronics, KT Corporation, Samsung Electronics, and LG Innotek. And during this workshop, private sector personnel discussed standards on scenario and data collection, standards for automated vehicle parts, and ideas to support and lead international automated vehicle standards. So considering the process of technology standards, it is inevitable that the Korean government will lead because it's the government that does the standard setting processes in Korea. Nevertheless, private companies have not been taking a backseat. It is evident that the private sector has been involved in standard setting processes in two main ways. The most obvious way is for the industry leader to assume a position that allows some influence over the standards. Cho from Hyundai Mobis is the most prominent example, but his term will last only 2 years, starting in 2024, as I mentioned. The second way is to have dozens of mid-level technical experts deeply engaged in writing standards. So in the long run, the second strategy will have more impact than the one top executive devoting a few hours a week to managing a standards organization. And although Korean companies are engaged in setting international technology standards, they play a large role in promoting the adoption of these standards, particularly by incorporating the standards into new products and services. They often shape the strategies of tech companies and early adopters around the world, which in turn drives development of new standards and highlights issues that need to be addressed. I don't want to dive into this extensively in this talk because of the time restraints, but looking at the mobile payment systems in Korea, it is evident that companies played a significant role in the deployment, distribution, and the use of technology. And if you're interested in this, I strongly recommend that you read the full manuscript. It's very interesting, I promise. While the private sector in Korea has produced several international leaders who have taken a top-down approach to setting standards, Korea should also do more to build out bottom-up approaches that involve employees and the public in order for the countries to exercise more influence within the international standard-setting community. And I'm almost done. I'm just going to summarize the key points. So the following points may be further discussed to improve the democratic process of technology standard setting in Korea. 1, greater involvement of corporate researchers, developers, and engineers. 2, greater involvement of corporate leaders in the international standard setting scene. 3, involvement of the public, especially for consumer-oriented technologies. 4, greater transparency of technology standard setting processes through reports and or recording of workshops. And 5, opportunities for the public to learn more about standard setting processes, especially regarding consumer-oriented technologies. And because new and emerging technologies are now developing at a speed that's difficult for regulators to match, private standard setting and voluntary standards have become increasingly important, and corporate actors often play a critical role. And we ask for a deeper discussion on voluntary technology assessment and private standards may be required to further promote the development of safe technologies. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. And thanks for providing a multifaceted view of how standards are developed and also focusing on the fact that it's not just the standards setting and the drafting of these technical standards. It's how can big companies shape the market and
Exactly.
lead to standardization around
Right.
1 or 2 standards. A quick question for you. As you look at the 4 case studies and consider other critical standards that affect Korean technology companies, is there one area that you think Korean companies have been really good at? And it doesn't have to be the 4 examples. Is there some place where there's a real concerted effort to do more to shape what technologies are being used?
So regarding technology standards, I think the role of cooperation has been largely limited because by definition, in Korea, the processes tend to be very government-led. But when it comes to mobility, when it comes to different technologies that's being promoted by the government to be supported, we have 12 new and emerging technologies that government support. And I don't remember all 12, but some of them include new and emerging mobility technologies, which includes automated vehicles, shuttles for the elderly, and so on. We have quantum computing that the government is supporting. AI obviously is becoming one of them. So the government is very much interested in these very new and emerging technologies.
But do you have one that you would point to and say, boy, they've really got their act together. They really are doing a good job?
I'm very biased here because I study transportation. So I'm going to say mobility.
Well, it makes sense. Yeah, Honda. Okay. Thank you so much for being concise, and thank you for a great chapter. You've touched on the key points, but there's 10 times more reason to read it than so.
Thank you so much.
Read it not once but twice.
Thank you.
So Mallory, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for helping review the papers as they were being drafted, and thanks for all that you do on technology standards. Mallory is currently the Chief Technology Officer at the Center for Democracy and Technology. She's really a multi-stakeholder person. We always hear about the multi-stakeholder process, but some people are representative of several different stakeholder groups. She worries about human rights. She's very much focused on the user perspective and how technology is used. And her work includes work on encryption, censorship, and cybersecurity, not just in the US, but globally. So she is the perfect person to talk about the standards and also talk about the policy and the politics. So I know that's quite an assignment, Mallory, but please share your thoughts on those issues and on the study itself.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Please let me know if I'm not coming through loud and clear. I think this is actually hopefully an easy assignment. I've enjoyed reading the report, and I can say that a lot of what's already been said aligns with my perspective on things. So I think coming at this from a different approach, I'll be echoing a lot of what has already been said about, the role of governments in standard setting, and how to maybe think about specifically internet and digital technology standardization, which is the focus of my work. So I think that it's correct to look at governments as multifaceted when it comes to engagement in standards. There's not one single mode of engagement, and given how many different bodies there are, we're sort of multiplying these different modes of engagement by the number of standards bodies that are out there and the technologies that are to be standardized. And of course, I'm also considering that the report, just like the report, we're also thinking about corporations that come from certain countries as being part of a national standards strategy for it, whether or not that strategy is strong or not, I guess is the question. But so when I think we are talking about what is Korea doing around standard setting, I think we're being really wide as well. We're not just talking about government. So, governments are sort of two things, maybe three. They're implementers. Some governments actually implement technology. They make it, they write it, they have a purpose for that technology. Often it's, identity systems and sort of smart cities and that sort of thing. Then, like has been mentioned, procurers. Maybe the government itself is not the only user of a certain technology, but needs it to run on. And so they're procuring technology that's being made by companies typically. And maybe they're national companies, maybe they're international companies. I think we've seen a lot of diversification of offerings by different companies, those even that are multinationals, that national governments are increasingly starting to adopt, even in countries like Europe, for example, adopting US technology. This is not new, but it obviously compounds the situation. And then maybe the third thing, the governments specifically are stewards of the public interest. they're really just there to monitor what's going on or to promote certain approaches. You see this a lot, for example, maybe in India. Their approach is to talk about digital public goods, digital public infrastructure. That's less, it's not only government implementing technology or government procuring technology, it's also governments pointing the way forward towards certain kinds of technology development with certain kinds of values embedded as well. So that's sort of the third thing. And I would say that, when we're talking about those values, I would say most stakeholders, like myself, coming from civil society, are really focused on human rights as a grounding for those kinds of values. So where we see economics also driving some of the values when governments are advocates or working in standard spaces, those tend to result in more digital sovereignty or more kinds of designs that actually aren't as open as they would if they sort of come from a human rights basis. So when I engage, when folks like me that are public interest technologists engage, we'd like to see more governments also do the same, where we take more of a broader, more universal approach to those kinds of values and less of a economically protectionist approach. I would say just to move into, I think, some places where I would add to the report and its framing of these issues is that sometimes for a government to be successful or to have a successful standard strategy doesn't actually mean that the standards are sort of developed and then drafted and then accepted and then implemented and become the dominant standard. Like, that's a very tall order. And actually any intervention along that journey can be seen as a positive, especially now when we look at the internet in particular. There's not much more to it on a really broad, grand scale. No one is going to reinvent TCP/IP, right? What's the job now, the task ahead of us now, is to actually evolve what we already have, to iterate and to improve and to roll out. So, well, you might not be able to get, Korea could have its own standard that then dominates in the market. What's really important, though, is to be an early adopter, to be an implementer that is interested in interoperability, right? And that helps to build consensus around what is the best standard. So while maybe a big tech company is actually the drafter of some standard, having the ability to influence how that standard actually is designed ultimately by being an early implementer while that standard is in active development, giving feedback and shaping the way that standard actually ends up being written down and then implemented and then put into the market. All of those are places where more consensus is needed and more participation is needed. And I want to also sort of use the counterexample, which is the US, and it's been talked about before, which is the US is really exceptional, especially in digital technologies, because of the first mover advantage it had. But I would say, though, now looking back and trying to assess where the US is at now, with the, for example, the transition of the IANA function out of the US, there have been concerted efforts over the last several years to actually make sure the US is not so dominant. And so as a result, I think the US actually has to mute to some degree its involvement in internet governance and standards, because it's seen as sort of, counterproductive or sort of anti-pattern when we do want these sort of standards bodies and the internet itself to be more global. So I feel like I should probably stop soon because we've got more speakers to go. But I just wanted to leave you with, I think the idea is, we want to ask governments actually to push less for their own kinds of standards, their own sorts of implementations that are compatible with their jurisdictional requirements, and actually work to harmonize more. And so more involvement is absolutely required for governments. It's a really good thing, but in a way that sort of aligns with and works towards building consensus on the standards development and the evolution of those standards that we already have.
Well, thank you very much. And sometimes the answer isn't to have one, quote, best standard. The US showed that with the early cell phones. The Europeans were saying GSM is the answer, what's the question? And the US took a much more laissez-faire approach, and we had 3 standards that were developing radically different technology. And in the end, we kind of took the best of each and went to the next generation. And that became kind of the backbone of the next generation of cell phone technology. It was because our emphasis was on interoperability and constantly innovating rather than trying to get everybody to use the same thing and freezing in that answer. Quick question for you, Mallory, though. As you look at what Korea has done in standards and in policy, is there an area that you would point to and say, that is something other countries should learn from?
Nothing immediately comes to mind. I think that because I am, so focused on all of them, and I really appreciated the ability to compare Malaysia, Japan, Korea, and the US. I learned a lot more from that report than I ever knew before. So you all are definitely the experts on this. And it's been really great to see this kind of analysis get built out, because I think you can extrapolate to a lot of other countries.
Okay, I'm sorry. I kind of asked you a trick question and you gave exactly the right answer. The fact that we don't know enough about Korea is partly a language problem, partly because Korea is still learning how to work in these international bodies. The fact that the government did so much of the standard development and standard promotion meant that the international companies, even though they have a lot of play, a lot of power, and a lot of market, they haven't engaged as effectively around the world. But I think, as Dasom said, that is definitely changing. Let me now turn to Naomi Wilson, who's going to give us a sort of broader picture and reflect a little bit on what else is going on in Asia. Not just Korea. She spends a lot of time on Korea, but her job is as Vice President of Asia and Global Trade Policy at the Information Technology and Industry Council here in Washington. They have offices elsewhere in Europe, and they play a global role. A lot of her time, of course, is focused on US-China policy, but she also works on export controls and digital policy in Asia and multilateral organizations. A fun fact about Naomi, she has been involved in the launch of all 3 of our Korea projects, and and the reason she's here is because she does know the technology, the policy, and the politics. So Naomi, reflections, suggestions, questions, particularly if you have questions for Dasom. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much. That's a tall order to be able to follow up and tie all of these interesting threads together. And thank you for the opportunity to be here for this discussion. I really enjoyed reading Dasom's chapter, and Korean standards and Korea's participation in international standards are indeed less well understood. There tends to be a lot of focus on what the US does, what Europe does, what China does, and those are kind of the 3 big models. But Korea shouldn't be underestimated by any means. And there are areas where Korea has done things well, and there are certainly areas for improvement. I want to echo first the last piece of our conversation, talking about the need for the diversity of standards, and for the standards and the technology to set up a competitive dynamic within the market. And ultimately that is the preferred option, where the best standard wins, the best technology and the standard that is most appropriate for the current technology and for the consumer needs is effectively selected by the market. And so I absolutely echo Mallory's call that we want countries to get away from the country unique standards and the sort of security driven sense of, well, we need something that is tailored to our security requirements and our economy. and really learn to rely on international standards as the preferred course, and certainly to reference them in regulations and law, and to make them mandatory when it's appropriate. So we're getting some feedback, at least I am. But to get back to the report, and I really liked the focus on automated vehicles, because Korea has, especially in the last decade, been especially competitive in the vehicle sector and now in the EV sector. And as that competitiveness progresses, it's even more relevant and even more important for Korean companies to be engaged in international standards, particularly with respect to cybersecurity and privacy. I mean, I know AI is the buzzword, and autonomous driving is very much linked to that, but undergirding that technology is, of course, data and privacy and cybersecurity. And so those are really the foundational elements of the future of next generation AI, as well as autonomous vehicles. I also want to emphasize the call for more mid-level expert participation. The language barrier, I think, can be tricky, and I don't have an immediate solution for that, but maybe AI does. But you really need those experts and engineers who understand the nuts and bolts of the technology to be contributing to international standards, so that you get the best outcomes and you get that mix of expertise, and that will serve the market and foster that global interoperability and competitiveness to an even greater degree. On the government side, I think the Korean government needs to still shift its mindset from being so top-down and directive to pushing for that bottom-up. And that's a struggle for a lot of governments to really entrust their private sector to lead. But it is important. And there are ways to do that, to incentivize participation, especially as certain Korean companies are growing and maybe don't have the resources to participate in every international standards body, or they don't necessarily know where they should be plugging in. That is an area where the government can assist, can provide support, even funding or other incentives for participation of their experts, because that is a really important piece of Korea's competitiveness. And finally, the reference in regulation and law. We still see Korea create some unique standards, especially in the security sector. And obviously, a lot of issues come back to security concerns when it comes to Korea. That's nothing new. But I think the more that the Korean government and Korean stakeholders participate in international standards, the more they'll be able to recognize that these are really the state of the art of security or privacy, data protection. And so referencing them is not just using what is readily available and not something that's bespoke to Korea, but it's really the product of international experts, technical experts who have reviewed these standards and specifications and worked to make sure that they are appropriate to the technology. Regionally, I think it's great to see that Korea has participated in mutual recognition programs, in particular with respect to conformity assessment. That is a big market access concern for a lot of companies across the region when governments again decide that it's not enough for us to have a standard or a mandatory standard, but we also need to set up our own testing, certification, and conformity assessment processes. And so Korea's participation in those international and regional mutual recognition regimes is really important, and that's something that should be encouraged going forward. I will stop there because I know we want to get to questions and some further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very concise and very specific. I'm going to turn to you after I do something impossible, which is I'm going to try to summarize in 2.5 minutes the excellent chapter by Byung-il Oh, who could not join us today, but he provided this detailed report card. He focused mostly on data protection and data infrastructure, the ways that the Korean government is trying to make more data available for artificial intelligence, statistical analysis, e-government, while at the same time protecting the privacy of individuals and the corporate data of companies. What he did was, as I say, quite heroic and a little bit risky, because obviously he probably made some people angry back in Korea. I should say, though, not all of these grades are from him. We took some of the work that had been done previously to provide grades for data localization and for data architecture. But let me summarize what he came up with. First off, in the area of connecting the unconnected, I think we all agree Korea was an early pioneer. They have a huge advantage. 80% of the population lives in large apartment buildings, which are pretty easy to wire, but they get an A and maybe even an A+ in terms of connecting the unconnected. In the area of broadband competition, which I've already mentioned, they had been doing very well. And then about 5 years ago, passed a law that requires all of the small internet providers to subsidize the 3 big players, including Korea Telecom. And that has completely distorted the market. It's stopped the decrease in the price of bandwidth. South Korea used to have the cheapest broadband. That's no longer the case because of this law. And this is a place where the Europeans can learn from the Koreans, because they have one particular member of the European Commission who's pushing for a Korean-style law in Europe. A lot of people opposing it, but again, a place where we can learn from the Korean experience, which has been a bad experience. Dr. Oh gave Korea a B for encryption. They've had a pretty solid discussion about what's needed there and the trade-offs of providing better cybersecurity, at the same time making it more difficult for the police to listen in on conversations. The worst grade he gave, and he is a very hard grader, was he gave an F for cybersecurity of government systems. The non-government systems did better. They got a C and they're improving. You'll have to read the report to see the details on that. Digital identity, a C, but again, they're improving pretty quickly. And we documented that in the previous report. Content moderation, a really thorny issue that we've been struggling with here in the US. Korea gets a C, the US gets a C. And in data localization, a previous study found that Korea got a B. The situation in the US until about 6 months ago was a very solid A. For 30 years, the US had been pushing the free flow of data while protecting the privacy and confidentiality of that data, working at the WTO, OECD. We had bipartisan support. Whatever administration was in the White House, free flow of data. And then a few months ago, the White House decided, without much consultation, no, actually, we're not so committed to working on that. I mean, good idea, but maybe we'll work on other things. And so that was an example of how not to do digital leadership, because there was a change in policy without anybody knowing it was coming. Data architecture, both the US and South Korea get a B. Data protection in South Korea, which is the area that Dr. O is most focused in, he gave them a B, mostly because the law is very clear and they've done a lot of detailed thought on questions like how do you use anonymized data to make more data available while doing a better job of protecting privacy. And that's, if there's one thing I would tell people who care about privacy to read, it would be those 4 or 5 pages where he talks about how they've developed a policy and are trying to implement a policy regarding anonymized data. And then he also pointed out that in the area of regulation of AI, Korea is somewhere between a C, which is better than most countries, and an I, which is what almost everybody else would get because we're so early in the development of policies related to AI. So with that, let me turn back to you and say, you all know the fights we're having here in the US. You know, we've had 40 hearings on content moderation alone in this year and last year. As you look at Korea and this report, is there 1 or 2 places you think the US could really learn a lesson? Is there something that we should emulate? Is there something we should avoid emulating? I leave that to, I don't know who wants to take that first. Dasom, you've spent a lot of time in watching both cultures. Do you have a tweet you want to give us? Is there something you would say, pay attention?
I don't, so I don't think I'm qualified enough to talk about the politics of the US. I just
None of us
study. I study technology.
Well, I am talking about policy, technology policy.
Sure. I think what we can learn from, like the place we can learn things from, is actually the EU. So I'm going to bring another geographical region into the discussion. So what they've done regarding privacy, regarding how AI is going to impact us, they've done a wonderful job. So the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, the EU AI Act, they've both been exemplary in regulating these new and emerging technologies. And I think both Korea and the US can actually learn from this. And going back to what Mallory said before regarding international collaboration, international regulations, I think the EU has been really playing a key role in providing at least templates as to how we can approach these international regulations, because as you know, the EU is not just one country, it's just, several countries there, which means that there's the EU regulation, and then each country has to adopt to that regulation and how they're going to apply to their own nation, which means that, when it comes to international regulations and international regulatory pathways, the EU's model can actually be useful for many countries and for many international organizations out there. So I apologize if I've even further complicated discussion, but
well, I was going to bring up India, so I think most of us do not think that China is a very good model in this area. But
right.
Mallory, you work internationally. Is there something that you would point to in the Korean model?
Yeah, so I just want to take a moment to cheer the lack of backdoors and encryption debate that's happening in Korea. I think it's not nothing, given that almost every country, especially the big ones, I mean, the US is not at all exempt, and it's Five Eyes, 49 Eyes friends. Korea is largely not debating this. And that is really important. I think it speaks to the fact that, the encryption debate is an absolute paradox for governments, right? On the one hand, you absolutely need strong encryption. It is crucial for security, and not just the security to, for economics and for commerce, but for national security, for the government itself to be able to operate in a secure manner. At the same time, right, then and this is somewhat wrapped up in some countries anyway, with the content moderation debate, which is unfortunate because it's a really, really tricky, if not impossible task to do content moderation at scale with encryption thrown in, right? It's just incredibly difficult and challenging from a technical perspective, but it also really erodes this faith right, in security. So that Korea can avoid having this sort of paradoxical discussion about encryption and really just focus then on the importance of data protection, security, all the things that that encryption helps you achieve, actually is a really excellent approach. And I wish more countries would just settle this once and for all, accept that strong, ubiquitous end-to-end encryption is everywhere, right? And it's just not going away, and then work to build on top of it and work to leverage the benefits from that.
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned it. I worked in the Clinton White House, and when I arrived in the office on January 21st, 1993, the day after the inauguration, the first thing that Al Gore gave to me was the encryption portfolio. And it's been an impossible issue ever since then, because it isn't a matter of one agency's pulling that way and the other one's pulling that way. This is almost diametrically opposed. I mean, at the time, the head of the FBI was seriously asking questions like, well, why do we let Americans buy encryption from other countries? Why don't we just, close it all down? And we're still fighting it. The unfortunate thing is, in most countries, the debate is completely under the table. It's often in a classified room, and you can't have a full debate. And it was hard then. It's harder now because more is at stake. So Naomi, what do you point to? Where would you learn from Korea, and how would you learn from Korea? That's the other question we could pose.
Sure. Well, I really wish the U.S. would learn from Korea with respect to public transportation, because their system is amazing. But that's not entirely germane to this conversation. I think I'm going to answer your question a little bit of a different way and pick up one of the threads that you put down on recent changes in U.S. policy with respect to data and data flows. And I think, if governments can learn one thing, and U.S. government in particular, it's that industry is sounding the alarm on fragmentation across the global economy for a reason. And this is becoming an increasingly serious concern. It's nice to give a wink and a nod to public-private partnerships, but governments really and truly need to listen to their technical experts in the private sector, because they are the ones that know the technology, what it can and can't do. They know the vulnerabilities, and they know how to address some of the concerns, or at least start to identify how to address some of the concerns that governments are rightly raising, and have raised issues about with respect to privacy and security, and what advantages can be had from data and mass surveillance. Those are all legitimate questions, but the fragmentation of the data governance environment is problematic. And I also want to point to what's happening in the WTO right now. So it's the 13th ministerial conference, and the moratorium on e-commerce is on the line, which in some circles is kind of a niche issue, but basically we're talking about enabling free flows of data without being tariffed or taxed, just because governments are looking for another source of revenue. And there seems to be a real void in leadership in those conversations. And from what I'm hearing from my colleagues who are on the ground in Abu Dhabi, is that there's just so much horse trading and refusal to negotiate across different countries. And that's really disconcerting. And I think it should be a signal to the international community that these things take cross-governmental and cross-border cooperation. And if no one is there to lead, and it doesn't have to be just one single nation, but if we don't take the need for leadership seriously, then it devolves into a food fight. And I'm afraid that's what we're seeing right now.
Thank you very much. We've quickly covered a lot of territory, a lot left to cover. We only have about 4 minutes left. But let me throw out a very provocative question. We've gotten a number of questions. This one's from Elliot Maxwell, who was in the Clinton administration and really was probably the lead drafter on the report that became known as the Magaziner Report. In 1997, the White House issued a vision for global e-commerce. And he points out in his question that we all believe that more information makes for better policy. We all believe that more voices with different perspectives often lead to better solutions. But he points out, and I would agree, that sometimes if you don't handle all those different voices well, you get stuck. And that sometimes you do need some high-level push, or you need somebody putting a deadline on to get it done. I mean, I call it Nelson's rule of listservs. The people with the least to say have the most time to say it. And so you can get these situations where one person with one opinion somehow gets to have as much space in the debate as the most important players who are developing the technology and the most important customers who are buying the technology and the most important governments that are trying to address a wide range of societal issues. So in 1 minute each, tell me whether we're all wrong, and tell me whether there's some way that digital leadership can deal with this cacophony of voices and still get something done in short order.
Shall
Or
I
tell
start?
me whatever you want to say. Remarks are.
Being a scholar, being a professor, there's a theory called the quadruple helix in policy studies. And the quadruple helix talks about the importance of researchers, corporations, the governments, and the public, and how the relationships between all of these stakeholders actually matter, and that they should all work together to encourage innovation, to encourage policies, to develop policies around innovation. And I think that's a really important lesson that we can learn from that theory, that sometimes the public is left out, and sometimes is the civil society, sometimes it's the researchers. And maybe we can find more venues, or we can find more places where we can actually interact physically and virtually like this. I think that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I fear here in Washington that too much of our discussion and too many proposals on digital policy are not being written by lawyers or by technologists or by entrepreneurs. They're being written by the press secretary who works for the congressman who's trying to get lots of attention. And they get the attention, but we don't necessarily get good policy. Naomi, Mallory, any concluding remarks and any thoughts on how to deal with the cacophony of proposals and voices all trying to compete in the marketplace of ideas?
Yeah, from my perspective, at the global governance level, or the global standards level, if people are coming in with brand new ideas that they've not consulted with, I think they're doing it wrong. I think there are several steps before you get to the point where you can be useful and additive and, help, again, build that consensus at the global level. And I would say that, governments need to think in particularly more broad about this. And I mean, by thinking of civil society also as members of their delegations to multilateral institutions, as people who need to be consulted before, again, like what you're saying, Mike, the laws get written, the executive orders get drawn up, do that consultation work in a multi-stakeholder manner first, sort of like, a fractal of multi-stakeholderism, if you will. Like the more and more you go down, the more you've consulted broadly, the better it's going to be, to the point where if you're at the global level, you should know sort of where you're going and that you have sort of solid proposals. That just makes the consensus building, the adoption and the implementation so much easier.
Well, as a hardcore geek who studied to be a physicist, I am so excited to hear about the quadruple helix and the fractal policy. I'm a visual thinker too, so this is great. Naomi, you can give us one more image, or you can give us a bumper sticker, or you can tell us what else you need about this. But you have
might have to leave it to AI to solve this. But on that note, there are international standards bodies devoted to AI standards. So I would like governments to not reinvent the wheel and think that they have to write their own standards related to AI or gather their own experts. This is something that should be done globally, and there are currently fora that are open and available and doing the work. So we just need more of the experts and the governments to participate and support it.
And as Dasom said, more dialogues like this to share what is going on in places that we don't always hear about. Thank you again. Thank you for all the help you gave us in putting this together. And thank you for our audience, including those of you who contributed questions. We look forward to continuing the discussion. Take care.